How do you come up? Oh, somewhere like that. All right, thanks. So this is. All right. So good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? You're making faces already. You serious, or can you?
No,
You can't.
you kind of have to speak more directly.
Let me just hold it.
You can, though, that,
I guess that'd be kind of hard.
just like, that. There you go.
Is this okay?
Just speak up.
Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Hunt Schenkel. I'm the archivist here at the Schwenk Federal Library. And I'm just, this topic is a very sort of broad and complicated topic. And so I am just going to read my work that I've done so far, the research that I've done into this topic, because it's much more complex and involved than I can just speak extemporaneously about. So if you don't mind, I'll just start reading, and if anybody has any questions, you can wait till the end. If I get through it all, it's 17 pages. So we'll see. I'll try and read slowly. If it takes too long, I'm thinking maybe this will be 2 talks. Next year, continuation. Anyway, I think I'm just going to hold this. So the focus of my talk will be on, oops. All right, very high tech. Okay. Yeah, I think so, except this microphone's a little annoying. All right, excuse me. The focus of this talk will be on John Hartranft's time as Pennsylvania governor in the context of the post-Civil War economic and social upheaval. And though this paper uses Hartranft as a focal point, the focus will not be on Hartranft's governorship per se. I do not want to get into particulars about certain policies or even look at what he achieved or did not achieve. The purpose, however, is to present the context of the time in which he governed and the conditions under which he attempted to lead Pennsylvania. As was his time in the Civil War, the post-Civil War period was just as difficult. John Hartranft governed from 1873 to 1879. Let's see how it goes. Okay. A period of great economic and social disruption in America, and Pennsylvania was at the center of this transformation. The political, social, and economic situation had changed drastically since the end of the Civil War, with the destruction of the South's slave-based economy and its imposed Reconstruction. This meant that Northern economic interests had virtually no domestic opposition, so its ability to expand, especially its industrial capability, was seemingly unlimited. Northern control of Congress after the war led to ever higher tariffs, and behind the protective wall of these tariffs, American industry grew and agriculture expanded westward to feed the growing population of industrial cities. Outside of the South, the country's population was also expanding, especially in the urban areas. In 1860, there were 33 states with a total of population of 31 million. 53% of the labor force worked in agriculture. And the largest city was New York with 813,000. The second largest was Philadelphia with 565,000. In 1870, there were 37 states with a total population of 38 million. 50% of the workforce was in agriculture. The largest city was New York with 942,000, and the second largest was Philadelphia with 674,000. By 1880, there were 38 states with a population of 50 million. The largest city was New York with 1,200,000. The second largest was Philadelphia with a population of 847,000. The percentage of people who work in agriculture was 47%. But the expanding economy needed an ever-increasing workforce, and large numbers of immigrants came to the United States during this period. Throughout the 1870s and 80s and into the 1890s, Hundreds of thousands entered the country each year, nearly 800,000 in 1882 alone. The United States was the largest free trade market in the world. Railroad mileage doubled between 1865 and 1873 and increased by an additional 50% between 1873 and 1881. The iron and steel industry were direct beneficiaries of the expansion of the railroad system. Steel production increased from 19,000 tons in 1867 to 198,000 tons in 1873, 1,500,000 in 1881. In 1874, the United States was the second only to Great Britain in iron pig production, or pig iron production. The expansion of iron and steel production led to comparable increases in iron and coal mining. Coal mining and iron and steel production were connected to the railroads and in a complementary system in which the railroad industry could control mining interests. Trade unions therefore became a significant institution as well. In Pennsylvania, the Republican Party had emerged from the war with its interest in free labor and protectionist policies as the dominating force in state politics. Also, the Democrat Party throughout the state was viewed with suspicion because of its tacit support of slavery during the war and was not trusted by a large percentage of the voting base. This is especially true in the urban areas of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And though the end of slavery was a positive achievement, the economic system in the North was far from perfect. Economic interests or disputes still centered around tariffs and labor issues, and trusts were a way for money power to consolidate their power, while powerful, corrupt political machines, quote, especially in the cities, were a way to maintain political control of election and spoils. Therefore, the war had both a negative and a positive effect on the average American. Positively, the racial slavery was defeated, yet the period also produced another kind of despotism, that of the robber baron, and some would say, quote, wage slavery. In other words, in the words of author Robert B. Bruce, life was cheap as it was plentiful. The 1870s were the beginning of what would be called by Mark Twain the Gilded Age, an age of extreme wealth and excess. But when we refer to this time as gilded, we are talking about an extremely small, extremely select portion of society who controlled the nation's wealth, and therefore its industry, banking, media, just newspapers at the time, etc. Not many people were aware that the 1870s were also a time of terrible violence, poverty, and social disruption. In the 1870s, as the industrial economy expanded, it also became more and more unstable, and overproduction as well as overpopulation led to a major economic downturn. The era known as the Long Depression began at this time, and it was to last a long time, as the name obviously implies. Some economists say it lasted until the 1890s. Because of the boom and then bust economy, many people, especially in industrializing cities, were out of work, and crime became a major problem. People in the rural sections of the country also felt the heavy hand of despotic capitalism, and crime there became increased as well. As I said, this was a gilded age, but for only a very few. I'm going to read an extract from a book by Robert Bruce called 1877, Year of Violence. It sums up the age very well. To celebrate the 100th anniversary of the nation's independence, Philadelphia put on a gaudy, vulgar, high-spirited centennial exhibition. The exhibition's sponsors meant it to sum up the age, as it did. The exhibition displayed everything from Gothic soda fountains to Professor Bell's telephone, from the majestic Corliss engine to the alto relievo in butter of Iolante Dreaming, which I put up here. I had no idea who Iolante was, but I guess she's some sort of classic figure from the classical era, and it was some sort of opera or something in the 1800s. So actually very, very nice likeness. You would never know it's butter. To keep going, 1,000 works of groping art and sure-handed technology. Capping it all, the great cultural barbecue demonstrated that the finer things of life could turn a profit right in the middle of the worst depression the nation had ever suffered. While everyone within the grounds behaved himself admirably, crime, vice, and violence ran rampant just outside. Nobody bragged about that, and yet, like the show within, it caught the spirit of the times. So did the summer's big news story. At the height of the centennial jubilation, word came suddenly from the Little Bighorn that General Custer's command had been wiped out by the Sioux. The event shocked the nation, not so much because several hundred Americans had been slaughtered in the Indian country, it's because this time showed 250 of them were white, and the United States troops at that. Without some such twist, violence was not news in America of 1876. Violence flickered incessantly on every man's horizon that year. Thunderheads of fury had been massing for some time. In Pennsylvania, host to the centennial crowds, Governor Hartranft complained to the legislature about the growth of lawlessness in our national life. The South's Ku Klux Klan, he charged, had provided an example of systematic murder, arson, and other crimes committed with impunity. During the past decade, the violent elements latent in every civilized society had been getting a dangerous education, and commencement exercises seemed in progress. Hartranft aimed his message at terrorism in the mining regions, but his remarks could have applied as well to festive Philadelphia. In 1875, Philadelphia's homicide rate shot up by more than 50%, and the city of brotherly love maintained its killing pace right through the centennial year. So this is where John Hartranft finally makes his appearance, and a little background of his life is in order. Most of you are, of course, aware that John Hartranft was a Civil War general and Medal of Honor recipient. You're also probably aware that he was the 18th governor of Pennsylvania, but his early life is less well known. Hartranft was born in New Hanover Township near Figleysville on December 16, 1830, to Samuel Engel and Mary Ann Bucher Hartranft. In 1838, Samuel moved the family first to Gilbertsville, then to Boyertown, and finally to Norristown in 1844. Operating an inn and tavern, Samuel's business acumen and likability was a trait that John seems to have inherited from his father. John, like Samuel, intuitively and rather seamlessly joined the mainstream of English-speaking America, whereas Pennsylvania German accent did, on occasion, make him self-conscious. And later, even as governor, he was never comfortable as a public speaker. As the Harrisburg Daily Telegraph wrote in 1879, Hartranft is not a demonstrative man, not much flourish in what he does, being entirely organized for action and not for speech. John's education began at Tremont Cemetery in Norristown. He then attended Marshall College in Mercersburg in 1850, and finally, from 1851 to 1853, Union College in Schenectady, New York, where he earned a degree in civil engineering. Worked briefly for 2 railroad companies as a surveyor's apprentice, though this career path did not entirely satisfy him. However, while working in Easton, John did meet and marry Sally Douglas Sebring in 1854, whose father, Judge William Sebring, was a prominent Easton lawyer. Together, John and Sally would go on to have 7 children. However, 2 would die as young children and 1 in childbirth. The couple then settled in Norristown, where John worked for his father in the real estate and stage line business. He became deputy sheriff of Montgomery County as a Democrat in 1854, which was his first political position and exposure to the law. And in 1860, he was admitted to the bar. He was also active in numerous civic and business organizations, including the Masons, the Montgomery Hose and Steam Engine Company, the Norris Rifles Militia, as well as the state militia, where he was elected lieutenant colonel in 1859. Following the shelling of Fort Sumter by Southern secessionists on April 12, 1861, Colonel Hartranft quickly organized the 4th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment in Norristown, and it was commissioned by Governor Andrew Curtin on April 21st. And soon was sent south to Maryland and Virginia to defend Washington and prepare for the war's first offensive. Despite Hartranft's confidence in the fresh troops training, their lack of decent equipment and lack of decent pay, among other complaints, led to an unwillingness to continue their service after the 90-day enlistment ended on July 20th and 21st. This also happened to be the day before and the day of the first battle of Bull Run at Manassas, Virginia. Only 5 men, including Hartranft, remained to fight. Nearly the entire regiment decided that they had had enough and headed for home with the smoke and roar of the battle at their backs. This personal, excuse me, I guess I should do this. This personal humiliation dogged Hartranft for his entire career and delayed his desire for a well-deserved promotion until late in the war. Bull Run was the war's first major battle. Bull Run, the war's first major battle, was a disastrous defeat for the Union Army and deeply humbling to Hartranft. Nevertheless, before the battle, he offered his services to the commander of his brigade, Colonel William Franklin, as aide de camp, and he proved to be a great asset, maintaining order during the battles, during the first brigade's panicked flight as the raw, undisciplined troops retreated from the battle. For his willingness to stay on the field of battle and his discipline and bravery, Hartranft was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1886. Okay, I'll keep going. Returning to Norristown, Colonel Hartranft formed the 51st Regiment of Volunteers, which became his regiment through most of the war. Though they were to go on to fight in many of the war's major battles, and he and his troops distinguished themselves on numerous occasions. Hartranft was again and again praised by his superior officers. It would take too long to go into all the details of his military career, but a brief list here of the battles he was engaged in should suffice. He was in the Burnside expedition. He was at Antietam at Burnside's Bridge. He was at Fredericksburg. He was at Vicksburg, Knoxville, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, the Siege of Petersburg, the Battle of the Crater, and the Battle of Fort Stedman. And for his actions at Fort Stedman, he was promoted to the rank of brevet major general. At the war's end, the assassination of President Lincoln on April 14, 1865, led to the killing of Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, as well as the imprisonment of 7 other men and 1 woman suspected of being co-conspirators in a plot to assassinate the president and others. Also on the day, the new president of the United States, Andrew Johnson, appointed General Hartranft special provost marshal and military governor of the prison at the Washington Arsenal, where the 8 suspects were held. Hartranft was an excellent choice to lead this difficult and politically sensitive work. He had the organizational skills and sense of fairness to be both just and firm towards the prisoners. The alleged conspirators, I won't name them all, but one, Mary Surratt, were to be tried by the special tribunal in the Arsenal itself. But the treatment of the prisoners was harsh, even by the standards of the time. Hartranft was most lenient and gentlemanly towards the only female prisoner, Mary Surratt. He even allowed her daughter to stay with her in the final weeks of her captivity. Sadly, however, Surratt was to be the first woman ever executed by the federal government, and Hartranft's Democrat opponents would later use this act as negative propaganda in the rough and tumble politics of the period, labeling the Republicans the Hangman's Party. In Hartranft's political career, Hartranft left the army after the war, but soon found a new career in Pennsylvania politics. Originally a Democrat, he joined the Republican Party in the 1850s. His first position was as Auditor General, which he held from 1866 to 1873. The post-war depression hindered his job, but he was able to. I missed that. Sorry. He was able to keep finances in decent order. In his first term as auditor, he reduced the state's debt, and at the end of his second term acquired federal funding for military claims for damages during the war. The 1862 election, in which he ran against Democrat opponent Charles Buckalew for governor, was described as a dirty campaign. The Evans affair, which I'll talk about later, was a financial scandal where Hartranft was accused of allegedly receiving illicit funds from George A. Evans, the state collector of war funds. This was brought up incessantly in the press, and President Grant was worried about Hartranft's image and whether or not it would hurt the Republicans nationally. Even the German newspapers walked away from Hartranft somewhat. Despite this scandal, he won 35 of the 66 counties in the plurality of 40,000 votes, becoming the 18th governor of Pennsylvania at the age of 42. Grant also won the presidency with a plurality of 150,000 votes in Pennsylvania. In the end, all charges of corruption regarding the Evans affair were later retracted, and no one was ever found guilty. Nonetheless, the scandal nearly destroyed his bid for run of governor. And like the fourth embarrassing departure before Bull Run and the Surratt execution, this scandal would plague him throughout his political career. Actually, I just wanted to point out something, that this is the, as best I can tell, the original Capitol building in Harrisburg, called the Hills Capitol Building. It's a really, in my opinion, a very sort of charming little federal style building, which was replaced by another building. I cannot remember the name of that one, for maybe 20 years. And then the building that's around today, the current Capitol, was built. But when Hartranft was governor, this was the building that he was, this is the Capitol. Let's see. Throughout his 2 terms, his annual addresses to the legislature show us what he cared most about. Some of his interests included fiscal responsibility, education, help for the mentally ill, banking reform, constitutional reform, lower taxes. He's a good Republican. Strong militia, and the elimination of special legislation. However, his entire governorship was also hindered by the poor economic conditions previously mentioned. Hartranft returned to Norristown in 1879 after his second term as governor, but he remained very busy. He was made postmaster of Philadelphia and collector of the port there from 1881 to 1885. He was the 5th commander-in-chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, the leading Union Army veterans organization. He also commanded the Pennsylvania National Guard and was a major influence in its reorganization. He died on October 17, 1889, at the age of 58 of Bright's disease, which is a sort of inflammation of the kidneys. Okay. Do all that. Too much information. Though Hartranft survives his political career with his honest and upstanding reputation intact for the most part, throughout his tenure, he did face stinging and serious criticisms and accusations of corruption and impropriety from his Democrat opponents, especially in the partisan press. Based on the research I have looked at, there appears to be no evidence of any validity to these accusations, however. Late 19th century American politics were, for better or worse, so tightly controlled by powerful financial interests that corruption existed undoubtedly and even unashamedly. Yet the rule of law continued to exist, and many significant reforms were enacted to curb this corruption. Hartranft played an important role in this change. Nonetheless, to understand why the changes were needed, we must look at what inspired them. The Republican Party of Pennsylvania in the 1870s was controlled by the very powerful and notoriously unscrupulous politician and businessman, Simon Cameron. Most of you have quite possibly heard the name before in the context of the Lincoln administration or the US Senate, as Cameron was the first Secretary of War in Lincoln's cabinet and at various times Senator of Pennsylvania. It's impossible to talk about the 19th century Pennsylvania politics without getting into the life of this multifaceted, dynamic, and by most, if not all accounts, unethical man. Yet at the same time, he was also likable, warm-hearted, and helpful to both friend and enemies in need. He was a true politician. In the words of historian Paul Cahan, Simon Cameron was an amiable scoundrel. A review of his life may help us understand the way politics in Pennsylvania and indeed the rest of the country operated in the 19th century. I'm not sure I'm going to go into all this, but I'll try and get through some of it. Simon Cameron was an influential figure in Pennsylvania and national politics for much of the 19th century, and his political legacy was also significant as the people he placed in power, including his son Donald, continued to control Pennsylvania after his death. Cameron was born to a working class family in 1799. His father had been an immigrant from Scotland, and on his mother's side, he descended from Pennsylvania Germans. This family, the Foutses, had been one of the earliest to emigrate to Pennsylvania in the 1600s. He was born in Maystown in Lancaster County, but due to his father's early death, he was taken in by a family in Northumberland County. At the age of 17, he apprenticed himself as a printer to papers in Northumberland. He then moved to Harrisburg and apprenticed himself as a publisher of the Pennsylvania Republican. After 2 years, he was the assistant editor. This was the most influential Pennsylvania newspaper outside of Philadelphia. At the same time, he began to attend the sessions of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and here he met Samuel Ingram. He was the Secretary of the Commonwealth and owner of the Doylestown Messenger. In 1821, Ingram hired Cameron as the editor. He then worked for the Congressional Globe in Washington as compositor or typesetter, which recorded debates in Congress. Here he was able to meet national political figures such as James Monroe, John Calhoun, and others. In 1822, he was hired to work at the Lancaster Intelligencer. He also purchased the Republican and merged it with the Intelligencer. He was friends with John Andrew Schultze, the sixth governor of Pennsylvania. There's no Schwenfelder connection, as far as I can tell, even though his last name is Schultz. He spelled it S-H-U-L-Z-E. Schultz appointed him adjutant general as well in 1829. He then divested his stake in the newspapers, but made sure the control of them was passed on to his brother, James. Schultz also awarded him contracts for the construction of canals in Pennsylvania. Cameron made a fortune in railways, canals, and banking. He was first elected to the Senate as a member of the Democrat Party in 1845. He was a persistent opponent to slavery, but he switched to the Republicans in 1856. He won election to another term in the Senate in 1857 and provided pivotal support to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 Republican Convention. As Secretary of War, his tenure was marked by allegations of corruption and lax management. He was demoted to ambassador to Russia in January 1862. Nevertheless, after the Civil War, he won a third election to the Pennsylvania Senate in 1867, and this is when he built his powerful Cameron machine. It would dominate Pennsylvania politics for the next 70 years. A good example of Cameron's control the state, as well as garnering patronage from the federal government, comes from the following story in Kahan's book. In an attempt to consolidate his control over federal patronage in the Keystone State, Cameron set about ensuring the election of a pliable candidate as Pennsylvania's other senator. Projecting an era of standing above the fray, Cameron relied on his son Donald to take care of the details. He chose Representative John Scott for the Republican Senate nomination. Scott was a neophyte when it came to politics, and Cameron undoubtedly believed that Scott would follow his lead in dispensing federal patronage. Working through his son, Donald, Cameron engineered Scott's ascension to the speakership of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives in 1869, and then orchestrated his selection as the junior senator from Pennsylvania. Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, noted, "The railroad controls Pennsylvania, and Cameron has the adroitness to secure it." Kahan continues, "If consensus of opinion is to be relied upon, there can be little doubt of the influence exerted by Simon Cameron upon the Grant administration. In this regard, Cameron was one of a number of Republican senators, each firmly in control of the political machines of his respective state. They used their closeness with Grant to channel and control patronage and appointments back home. This kitchen cabinet included men like New York's Roscoe Conkling, Michigan's Zachariah Chandler, Indiana's Oliver Morton, and Massachusetts Representative and former Union General Benjamin P. Butler. Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican whose program on civil service reform eventually brought him into conflict with Cameron, complained in 1871, I fear that such advisors as Chandler, Cameron, and Conkling are too influential with Grant. They are not safe counselors. So that brings me to, in a sort of clumsy way, the next topic, which is the press. And these figures here represent what some people thought of the press and how it abused the information that it passed on to the public. This is from Puck magazine, which is a very famous satirical magazine in the 19th century. Okay, so I've labeled this calumny. Prior to the 20th century, newspapers were the only form of media which was able to reach a broad audience. In Pennsylvania, 95% of the public was literate. The press and politics had always been close in Pennsylvania, and editors and publishers used the papers to further their political careers. So to control the public's consumption of news, especially political news and events, the press evolved into a molder of public opinion through propaganda. Just get some water real quick. This type of propaganda was first used in Britain in the early 19th century, but was perfected in America in the 20th century. I'm, of course, writing about the 1870s. I feel that the ideas best expressed and summed up on this topic were made at a later and more cynical time following World War I. By the 1920s, the masses, people, populations, were basically treated like malleable herds that needed to be guided by elites. In the 20th century, Edward Bernays, known as the father of propaganda and the leader of the burgeoning field of public relations, as well as being the nephew of Sigmund Freud, wrote, "The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process. Conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society, and those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Therefore, there must be intelligence and information control," said another important 20th century figure regarding democracy and propaganda, Walter Lippmann. In other words, the psychology of perceived choice is used to manipulate people into voting for one of two parties in this system. Management consultant and former businessman Larry Romanoff wrote, in describing democracy in the press, multi-party electoral system was not designed and implemented because it was the most advanced form of government, but because it alone offered the greatest opportunities to corrupt politicians through control of money and to manipulate public opinion through control of the press. In other words, by making the masses think they are in control of the choice of electing two pre-selected candidates in their charge is in their charge. They're made to think that they're the ones in charge. Therefore, in a democratic system of government, the best way to control the population is to control the information they receive. To do this, the press must be able to manipulate opinion, but also must be able to make the public seem as if the choices they're given are up to them. And going back to the 1870s, these are some of the papers of the partisan press. These are the papers that were most widely read by people, Democrat and Republican. So now move to crisis. This is another part of the era of the 1870s that Hartranft had to deal with. In the 1870s, as talked about at the beginning of this paper, were years of great social unrest and extreme financial disparity among American citizens. The corruption of the political system, despite efforts to reform, and the polarizing exploitation of partisan political animosities in the press, almost as if it's by design, culminated in two of the decade's most violent crises of the era, where Pennsylvania and John Hartranft were at the center of both. The first crisis, these are just articles. I put them in here, but they're kind of hard to read. One is pro-Hartranft, and one is negative towards Hartranft. And I'm not going to read them all, but if anybody wants me to send them copies, I can do that. So the first crisis was the Molly Maguires. So throughout this time in the Pennsylvania coal regions, violent resistance to corrupt, exploitative working conditions by management towards immigrant Irish, mostly Irish, coal miners led to a campaign of terror by the miners themselves against anyone they deemed their enemy. A resistance organization calling themselves the Molly Maguires were a secret Catholic society which had organized in Ireland as a reaction to exploitative landowners and land agents. The name was derived from a legendary woman, Molly Maguire, who supposedly killed corrupt land agents. And the original Mollies wore dresses as disguises when conducting their attacks. In America, the mine owners and mine bosses became focus of the violence. The Mollies in America also grew out of the ancient order of Hibernians, which along with the Roman Catholic Church were two organizations that assisted poor and needy Irish immigrants. However, the Mollies took AOH, ancient order of Hibernians, took their ideas and transformed them into a secret, some would say terroristic organization whose goal seemingly was pure revenge and terror, which eventually took the form of maiming and outright murder. In America, Pennsylvania specifically, they operated in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, of Carbon, Columbia, Lackawanna, Luzerne, Northumberland, and Schuylkill counties. In the early days during the Civil War, the Mollies had opposed the draft because they felt it exploited Irish Catholic immigrants. In their view, as was the view of many Irish Roman Catholics, America was a Protestant country that deeply distrusted and disliked and exploited Roman Catholic immigrants. Coal miners worked under extremely dangerous conditions and earned somewhere between $10 and $35 a month. Miners and their families were also forced to buy all their goods from a company store, which charged high prices and forced the families to go into debt using store credit. Some speculated, however, that the Mollies did not even exist, while others blamed them for the crimes, all the crimes committed in the region. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Numerous people were killed in the attacks, and the Roman Catholic Church threatened to excommunicate members for their actions. In 1875, Bishop Wood of Philadelphia issued a public decree against the Mollies, and many other priests spoke out against the violence in sermons on Sundays. Not only did the priests and bishops despise the violence that the Mollies, like the Freemasons, not only did the priests and bishops despise the violence, but the Mollies, like the Freemasons, were also a secret organization. This seemingly violated the vows they had made to the church. Despite the violence, between 1865 and 1875, not one Molly had been convicted of first-degree murder. So besides the Catholic Church, the Mollies began to attract some very powerful enemies. One of the enemies was Benjamin Bannon. He was a journalist of Welsh ancestry who was the publisher of the Miners' Journal, which was a Whig or Republican newspaper. He was a teetotaler and an evangelical Protestant and very anti-Irish. He was also possibly the first to mention the Molly Maguires publicly in the journal in 1857. He labeled them evil and not just criminals. Bannon's use of the press to attack the Mollies is illustrative of the way public opinion was molded by powerful men. Opposed to the church's moral call for cessation of violence, social and religious opponents of the Mollies did not necessarily care about the violence, only that the violence was focused on them, and their business interests. Another person who was even more fervently anti-Molly than Bannon was Franklin Gowan, president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroads. This company owned many mines in the anthracite region, and Gowan hated strikers. He wanted to show that the Molly Maguires, as well as trade unions, which he also hated, were one and the same, which of course is a lie. He hired Pinkerton detectives to find out the trouble. One man in particular, James McParland, was hired to infiltrate the Mollies in 1873, using the pseudonym James McKenna. If anybody saw the movie The Molly Maguires with Sean Connery and Richard Harris, he's the Richard Harris character. He was inducted into the Ancient Order of Hibernians in 1874. In 1876, 50 Mollies were arrested by the Coal and Iron Police thanks to McParland's report, and many indicted for murder and other offenses. The subsequent trials were also very corrupt and calumnious. The state failed to do any real oversight and basically allowed Gowan's company to carry out justice. Irish Catholics were excluded from juries. Many of the jurors were actually Pennsylvania Germans and spoke very little English. All the prosecutions had to do was prove defendants were members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which the prosecution called an international conspiracy, which was also used to stroke anti-Catholic feelings. Jack Kehoe, the suspected leader of the Mollies, was even convicted for the murder of a mine foreman, Frank Langdon, in 1862, which was supposedly the first murder carried out by the Mollies. Evidence in all the trials was very thin and mostly relied on testimony of McParland and other state's witnesses. Between 1877 and 1879, 20 alleged Molly Maguires were hanged by the state. Again, this scandal plagued Hartranft, as he was accused in the Democratic papers of buying votes in the counties of the coal region from the Mollies leadership in exchange for clemency of the accused Mollies given the death sentence. He did win re-election in 1876, and many suspected that his re-elections showed a Hartranft Molly connection, where votes for cash were alleged in the Democratic papers. Nevertheless, he denied all charges and was never found to have done anything illicit, and most unfortunately, did not rescind any of the death sentences of the accused Mollies. Most significantly, in my opinion, the new state constitution and pardons made it even difficult for the governor to pardon people. It had to go to a board now with the new state constitution. The board had to approve all pardons. So even if Hartranft did want to pardon somebody, he would have had to do it through the board. Despite these convictions, in 1879, Joe Wayne, great-grandson of owner of Jack Kehoe's Hibernian house in Gerardsville, Schuylkill County, fought for and got a pardon from Governor Milton Shapp for Kehoe's 1862 conviction of murder. The second crisis was the 1877 Great Railroad Strike. This also occurred during Hartranft's second term. The railroad strike was possibly the largest strike anywhere in the world in the 19th century. Throughout the country, railroad workers, as with the coal miners, were angered by decreasing wages and extra workloads due to the depressed economy. The Civil War boom ended in 1873, which caused a chain reaction in industry, and many of the competing rail companies fought each other through ticket price decreases, which drove wages down even further. Yet what drove the workers to strike was the company's push for longer hours and less pay, while the owners continued to make profits. The strikes began on July 14th in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and federal troops were called for. But the strikes quickly spread throughout other parts of the country, and the most violent protests anywhere occurred in Pittsburgh on July 19th through July 30th, where roughly 50 people were killed during the rioting, and 2 square miles of the city were destroyed by fire. Let's see. On July 19th in Pittsburgh, the militia under Alfred Pearson was not able to stop strikers, which had truly turned into a mob of not just rail workers, but the general population. Pennsylvania Railroad President Thomas Scott demanded military protection of all railroad property. While Governor Hartranft made his way back from a trip out west, Scott petitioned the federal government by personally appealing to President Rutherford Hayes. In response to Scott, a critical supporter in his election, the president ordered strikers to disperse within 24 hours. Pittsburgh City Police and local units of the National Guard sympathized with the strikers and refused to act against them. While it's still on his way back east, Hartranft then directed other National Guard troops from Philadelphia, who were presumably non-sympathetic to Pittsburgh, intending to offer the strikers what Scott called a rifle diet for a few days. It's almost finished. Angry crowds of men, women, and children greeted the troops with taunts and boos as they advanced and with lowered bayonets. Some of the troops were trapped in the railroads roundhouses, to which the mob set fire, and the soldiers shot their way to safety. They fired into the crowd, killing 20, including 1 woman and 3 children, and wounding many more. Outraged at the killing, the workers from nearby iron mills and other industrial shops poured into the railroad yards and took them over. Throughout the night of the 21st and 22nd, sporadic gunfire was exchanged with the soldiers. The crowd burned 39 buildings, including the Union Station, as well as 104 locomotives and 506 freight cars. 20 more local residents and 5 guardsmen died. On July 28th, Governor Hartranft finally arrived with a greater show of force. Let's see. And there was a total of 3,000 troops that finally showed up. The railroad officials met with strikers, and Scott agreed to negotiate all grievances so that few of the rioters were arrested or prosecuted. The Pennsylvania Railroad, however, eventually did settle for with the Allegheny County for $1.6 million. Hartranft was again criticized for using excessive force by the National Guard. At the same time, he sympathized with the workers' grievances, but because of the violence of the strikes, harsh measures had to be taken and law and order had to be restored. I forgot to put this. Because of the violence, many labor reforms were created, and it led to the reforming of a new Pennsylvania National Guard, which Hartranft headed after leaving office. And others saw a need due to the inability of the former Guard to handle such problems. Okay, well, I'm just going to conclude here. So I've probably gone on long enough, but I think this information is very useful in understanding developments in Pennsylvania politics from the 1870s into the 20th century, and shows how support of individuals is determined by men in positions of influence. These men at the same time usually have their own personal interests, often business interests, and is the essence of political corruption. It is, of course, a very old system, but in a democratic Republican society or classically liberal form of government, this can be very dangerous because the power then is determined by money. The true nature of who rules then becomes an oligarchic because they are the power. Therefore, who is ultimately responsible is hidden. The politicians are the frontmen, but the real power is pulling the strings. Eventually, the money class becomes so powerful that a true oligarchy forms. This is what occurred after the Civil War in the Gilded Age of industrial capital. Once the Southern system was destroyed, Northern capital had no competition, and wage slavery could replace bonded slavery. So, sorry to be such a pessimist, but that's basically the way I understand the conditions under which Hartranft was forced to try and govern the state. And he was thrown all these very difficult problems. And in my opinion, I think he comes out very clean and very honorable. He tried to do the right thing every time. I think the only issue that he had possibly real trouble with was the Evans affair, was the corruption over the war loans that were collected. And I think he possibly did get money from this person, but he paid it back, and it was only a very small amount of money. But the press, the Democratic press, used that as whatever they could use. Of course, they would use it, and they used that as a sort of something to criticize him over. But in my opinion, governing under these conditions was pretty much impossible to seemingly do the right thing all the time, but I think he did the best he could. So, does anybody have any questions? I know it was a long and kind of complicated subject. Yes.
I want to be clear as to what you said about the strike. Was it nationwide or?
Yeah, the railroad strike was pretty much anywhere where the railroads were used. So, I mean, it started in West Virginia, moved to most of Pennsylvania. I think it went out to Ohio and Illinois. So, because after the Civil War, the railroads had grown tremendously, especially in the North. And so I think it was pretty much anywhere in the country. Yeah.
If I'm correct, the Pennsylvania Railroad is very large.
Mm-hmm.
And was the strike just against the Pennsylvania Railroad?
No, I think it was any railroad that was, all the railroads were the targets. So I'm not sure. I think the B&O Railroad was where it started, because it started in Martinsburg in West Virginia, and then it moved to Baltimore. And I believe that was B&O. So it was,
You referenced Union Station, is that Pittsburgh?
yeah, there's a little shot of it. Yeah, this is the picture of the station burning. It's a famous picture from Frank Leslie's magazine. There's a lot of good photographs, and I'm really sorry about not keeping the PowerPoint in sync with the talk. But if you go online, you can just Google railroad strike of 1877 Pittsburgh, and there's a ton of pictures. There's actually really good pictures, photographs of the damage that was done. It's pretty incredible. Any other questions?
If anyone online has questions, if you would.
Thank you. Well done.
Did you understand it?
Yes.